Just want to check and make sure we're live on both. Okay. Yeah, we are live on X, which is great. Matt, can you go to my X page and just make sure we've got sound there?
Yeah, I don't know if that may cause a feedback loop. Let me try.
All right. How do I check it on Alex? Do you know where to look on YouTube?
I usually go to studio.youtube.com, and then that will show me what's feeding live on my channel. And then from there, you can then click on a link on the right-hand side that'll take you to the actual video.
So I'm there now. I'm on the studio channel and I don't see.
I think it's behind a paywall, so I can't access it online. Is this
All right.
right? Is it behind the on videos webinars page?
Oh, here we go. Yeah. Yeah, we're live on YouTube.
All right.
Yeah, here it is. I found it. Matt, no worries.
Okay.
No worries. All right. We're live there. And let me just adjust this. Hang on. Stick with me, guys. All right. Yeah, here we are on X. And here we are on YouTube. All right, good. Streaming is working. All right. You guys ready?
I'm ready.
Already.
Let me bring this up. All right, here we go. Wait, no, we don't. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We work with hedge funds, family offices, registered investment advisors, and individuals like you to help you get better returns in the stock market. We're going to be talking about President Trump's tariffs today. I am here with Matt Pettit. He is a new DKI analyst. He is an MBA student at the London Business School and recently submitted some fantastic work here that impressed all of the finance people on the DKI board. Matt, glad to have you. Thanks for joining
Yeah, thanks so
us.
much.
I am also here with Alexander Macris. He's a polymath, an entrepreneur, an author, and game designer. He's the studio director of Autark LLC and creator of the best-selling RPGs, Adventurer, Conqueror, King System, and Ascendant. He's the author of Running on Empty, an analysis of the petrodollar system, and Arbiter of Worlds, a guide to the role-playing game hobby. In his spare time, he blogs about dire happenings at Contemplations on the Tree of Woe, a place where I've been fortunate enough to be a contributor. Alex was also kind enough to ask me to write the foreword to Running on Empty, a process I recommend, as it allowed me to have my name on the cover of a book without doing all the work of writing a book. As a professional game designer and observatory economist, Alex also authored another book called Dragons and Hayek, which explains how having a gold hoarding dragon in your village proves the economic benefits of hard money. Alex is also a thought criminal who holds multiple unapproved ideas in his head at any given time. Consider yourself warned. Alex, good to be talking to you.
Hey, thanks for having me. That bio was much better than the one I wrote, so thank you for having me on.
Yeah, well, all of it wasn't true, but here we are.
That's right.
The
Those are
the
the best
good
bios.
right, the good comments were true, but did you really write a book on dragon economics?
No.
All right, sad to hear. So Alex, the reason I wanted to have you on is you wrote a fantastic article over the weekend on balance trade. And the thing that I thought was so interesting is, I've been watching the FinX community lose its mind over the tariffs. And so many people are claiming there's no plan. This was all miscalculated. None of it makes any sense. And you argued that there is a source for these ideas. There is a detailed, well thought out plan, and the tariff calculations make sense. You may agree or disagree, but I think it's really important to put people in a position where they can um, get a sense of what's actually going on inside the White House, what's going on in the administration, and then decide for themselves whether they agree with the ideas or disagree with them.
Right, right. Yeah, the book is called Balanced Trade. It's by Jesse Richmond, Howard Richmond, and Raymond Richmond. It's a 3-generation family of economists. It was published in 2014, and it takes the position that the United States' chief problem is that it is attempting unilateral free trade in the face of mercantilist behavior with its major trading partners, and that the majority of the mercantilist behavior is being implemented through non-tariff approaches. And so simple reciprocal tariffs will solve the problem. And you need to aim for balanced trade, which means looking at the trade deficits. And it offers up a formula for how you should calculate what your scaled tariff should be and why you should put a scaled tariff in place. And the formula is the exact formula that the Trump administration used in imposing the Liberation Day tariffs. So having read this book and then seeing people publicly shriek as if no one had ever thought of this before and it was a crazy outlandish idea and off the cuff, it was just evidently false. Like there's a 143-page book by 3 economists that you can get on Amazon that explains it in detail and includes the formula. So I didn't write the essay necessarily as an endorsement or as a criticism, but simply as a counterpoint to people who are claiming there's no plan, there's no basis, this is irrationality. And certainly what we've seen, I think, has been a very irrational reaction. So I hope I helped reduce the irrationality a little bit.
That sounds good. All right. So I think the key element of what you were just talking about is, everybody focuses on tariff levels. And you're pointing out, wait a minute, there are non-tariff impediments to trade. That if you actually want to figure out what's fair, what's reasonable, who's playing on a level playing field, simply looking at tariff levels isn't enough for that. What are some of the non-tariff impediments to trade? What are some of the things that countries do to, the way we would describe it is cheat or play unfairly? What is being done against us here?
Well, so balanced trade goes into it. They highlight currency manipulation, export subsidies, non-tariff barriers. And then the Trump executive order, if you read it, is essentially riffing on or elaborating on the same material that's covered in that book. And so they go into import barriers and licensing restrictions, customs barriers, trade restrictive standards, conformity assessment procedures, sanitary measures that restrict trade without furthering safety, inadequate IP protection, discriminatory licensing requirements, discrimination in favor of domestic state-owned enterprises, corruption and bribery, domestic economic policies such as currency practices and value-added taxes, et cetera. So they have a huge list of them. And from that basis, they calculate what they think the impact of those non-tariff barriers is.
So to me, the thing that makes sense about this is if you could have a country that has low tariffs, but it erects all kinds of other barriers, that they may have a trade surplus because they're subsidizing their own industries, or in the case of China, stealing IP, forcing other companies to hand over their IP to do business there, which reduces the cost of R&D for their own companies, right? These things get passed on. And so there are all kinds of ways to quietly cheat. I think the advantage of this system, and I'm not saying it's the right one, but the advantage of this system is it looks at the outcome rather than one element of what gets you to that outcome when there are multiple moving parts. I think it's more of a dynamic analysis than a static one.
Right, right. And that's why in the book they call it a scaled tariff. And the idea is that you should be updating the scaled tariff every fiscal quarter or every period that you choose. The idea being that as trade flows adjust and the trade deficits change, that the tariff should change as well. Now, I don't think Trump has implemented that part. At least I haven't seen any evidence that that's how they're approaching it, but that's the process they lay out in the book, that you look at the prior 4 quarters, you calculate the trade deficit, and then you dynamically adjust it over time. And so the idea is that if someone attempts to retaliate against you or they tighten up, then the trade barrier simply goes up on your end automatically. And from the point of view, if you view trade wars as a game of chicken, the scaled tariff is essentially you've thrown the steering wheel out of your car, and so there's no point in playing chicken with you because you're not steering, you're going straight ahead. And so it just is left on the other guy. If he takes the right actions, the tariffs will automatically go down. If trade balance is restored, the tariffs will go down. If they're not, then they stay up or go high.
So let's talk about the game theory aspects of this. I thought it was something that you did a great job of explaining in your article. But the key point here is that the benefits to trade, the free trade people will always talk about the benefits to free trade, reasonably so. But your point is, yeah, but those benefits may not be evenly distributed or may be distributed in a way that your trading partner is taking more than 100% of the benefits.
Right, right. There's a number of different ways you can model it. There's one classic game they play when they test game theory is they give someone $100 and then they say, you have to share this $100 with your partner. And the partner can refuse or accept. And if they refuse, nobody gets any money. And if they accept, you both get the amount that you've shared. And so the question is, well, do you have to share it 50-50 with your partner? And it turns out that actually, one can make this case that no, rationally, the partner should accept it, even if you only offer them $1, because they're still better off.
A penny, you mean?
Yeah, a penny, right? They're still better off than if they didn't accept it. And yet we also know that in real life, people won't accept it in that case because there's a perceived unfairness where the other person is exploiting the system. So, the mercantilist sets out to systematically exploit the system in such a way so that the gains of trade stay just enough that the other person continues to participate in the free trade and appears to receive a benefit, but the vast majority of the benefits are diverted to the mercantilist, to China, etc.
All right, so I'm glad you specified, because otherwise, as soon as you use the word mercantilist, I was going to say I'm assuming you mean China.
I mean China.
Yeah, exactly. Matt, I know this is a subject where you have a strong point of view. The other day when we were talking, you were advocating for maybe more restraint on tariffs with everybody but China. Why are you making that distinction? What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of the direction that they headed in. But I think if you're trying to make meaningful change with China, I forget the number off the top of my head, somewhere around 10 to 20% is what the exports from China come to us. If you're trying to make meaningful change, you have to kind of address, not just that small portion, but come at them from, with a coalition. I'm curious if maybe that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. They kind of have changed, I feel like, the playing field a little bit right now, where, they're kind of isolating China. They're keeping those tariffs high. They're lowering tariffs temporarily, or, at 10% for kind of the rest of the countries. And I wonder if kind of during those trade negotiations, they kind of pursue some sort of agreement that they'll take on China, kind of in a multilateral fashion. So, I think that's one potential outcome. Yeah.
Okay. Alex, you were talking about having these dynamically adjusting tariffs. I think a lot of the arguments being made by the anti-tariff crowd are not, I don't think they're good arguments. We'll go through some of those in detail later in this conversation. But the best argument that they're making is people want certainty before they build plants, right? They ultimately, I think a big part of what President Trump is trying to do is reverse 40 years of deindustrialization, reverse 40 years of us selling off our productive capacity to other countries in exchange for free stuff, or cheap stuff, rather. Cheap stuff for free money, maybe, is a better way to explain it. So for us to reshore that capacity, people have to be willing to build plants. They have to be willing to build that capacity. Doing so is really expensive, and you wouldn't do it if you're worried that tariff rates are going to change in a quarter or a year. These things, they're looking for a decade plus of certainty. So if you have constantly changing tariffs, how do you then deal with the certainty that US companies or foreign companies who want to build productive capacity here in the US, how do we get around that? Because I think right now that's the best argument being made by the anti-tariff crowd. It's a good argument.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get certainty in a situation and a system that's designed to be uncertain?
I mean, that's a great question. I think that's the best criticism you can have to the scale tariff approach. In the book, they talk about the alternative approach, and I've talked about it on my blog, which is Ian Fletcher's National Strategic Tariff. And the idea there is that you just have a flat standard tariff that you apply across the board that simply makes it more efficient to invest and purchase domestically. He recommends a 25% national strategic tariff. It looks like what the Trump administration is trying to do is hedge its bets with a low national strategic tariff of about 10%, an initially very high scaled tariff based on trade deficits, and then they're willing to negotiate away that scaled tariff for partners that want to play ball, and that could work. I think the problem is the more you introduce complexity into an already complex system, the more uncertainty you continue to create. So we're still in the opening stages of the Trump salvo, of the art of the deal. And it's not clear to me, at least, how much of what's happening has been rigorously planned versus is being a bit improvisational with a loud opening salvo and then response to negotiation. But I agree. The too much uncertainty over too long a period of time is just as damaging to the opportunity to reindustrialize as too much mercantilism over too long a period of time. So it's a very, very difficult situation that the United States finds itself in, and we would have been much better off had we put these tariffs in place a decade ago, 2 decades ago. In the book, Balanced Trade, they talk about the fact that at a certain point, it would become impossible to put these scaled tariffs in place because the economy will simply no longer be able to handle it. It would be so disruptive, there would be no opportunity to recover.
I think that's the timing here is a key point. One of the things that I found really interesting is all the people saying, well, wait, if we put these in place, we're going to have economic pain now, and it's going to take years to build that productive capacity. And I'm thinking, okay, so what do you want to do? Because we've spent 40 years selling off everything that our grandparents and great-grandparents built. We now have national security issues all over the place. We don't produce our own semiconductors. We can't build ships. We don't produce our own pharmaceuticals. These are national security issues. We don't produce our own PPE, right?
Yep.
And so, you know, we have sold off so much of our productive capacity, and what we've gotten for that. And listen, it's been great for Wall Street. I've made money off of it. Great. And, it's nice being able to get inexpensive goods, but in exchange for, cheap goods purchased with free money, we've had 40 years of selling off what we've built. I don't know why people think that we're going to be able to reverse that quickly or in the time frame. And so, I see these people who they're seemingly calm, they're seemingly rational. And what they're saying is, oh, no, if you do this, we're going to feel pain. And to me, that's the equivalent of talking to somebody who has a heroin addiction and say, but if you cut off their heroin, they're going to have a really horrible next 2 or 3 days. Well, yeah, in exchange for a better long-term outcome. And so, I think in some ways, it reminds me a lot of what I've seen in Argentina. It's a country that I love. I've visited there multiple times. I have friends there. But Argentina used to be a very wealthy country, and then they pursued these populist plans where the government paid for everything, everywhere, all the time. And as a result, they would have a lack of economic growth. They lost their position as the wealthiest country per capita in the world. And then they also suffered inflation of more than 100% a year. Like I'd go visit a friend there for a month, and the exchange rate would change when I was there. And so, every 15 years or 20 years or so, they elect a reform government. And they say, okay, we've taken so much pain, you have to fix this. Well, what does the reform government do? They cut spending, they cut government jobs, they cut government benefits. These are the things that need to be done. And then everybody goes crazy. And they say, no, don't do that. Don't change that. That hurts me. And so it seems like everybody agrees that the status quo is unsustainable, that we need to make changes, but we have to do it in a way so that nothing changes. Right. And that is what we're seeing right now. People are screaming about an increase in US tariffs, but they're somehow okay with the fact that our supposed friends and allies and trading partners may have tariffs or other barriers against our goods and against our access to their markets that is far in excess of the barriers that we have against them. And I don't think people mean to be doing this, but they're effectively arguing for two things. They're arguing that it's okay for our partners to have high trade barriers as long as we don't, right? And they're arguing that, okay, I understand the current situation is horrible. It's unsustainable. We need to change it, but nothing can change. We can't experience the hangover or the detox or a rebuilding. And I'm like, listen, guys, we've been living off of a credit card since 1971. Right. So this question, Alex, Matt, is for either or both of you. What do you tell these people? What do we do? How do we change things without changing things, which I think is impossible, but how do we speak to the people who want that?
Well, I'll use an analogy. Right now we have an obesity epidemic in the United States. And once you get to a level of obesity, you can actually stop overeating and only eat the amount of calories that will sustain your current weight. And you will stop gaining weight and you won't feel hungry because you're eating the right amount of calories to sustain your body mass. But you will remain obese, and being obese will, limit your life in many ways and do damage to your heart and your body. And there is no way to lose that weight without eating less. You must cut the calories. You must go hungry. It is the only path to losing weight. And the same is the situation here with our economy, right? We have essentially gorged ourselves on debt and imported goods, and we have sclerosis and heart damage of the economic body. And there is no way to improve the situation without undergoing the pain of the repair, the same as a person who is obese. And the alternative, the people that are crying about it and suggesting, no, we can't do this, they are the equivalent, they are the economic equivalent of nutritionists who tell you you can be healthy at any size. They are liars.
So here's the interesting question. Are they liars, or are they people who are talking their book? And so, like, one group of people I have some sympathy for, the other I don't. The people I have some sympathy for, I think ultimately, we look at some of these towns in the Midwest that have just been wiped out by jobs being outsourced, by jobs being sent overseas, and unemployment is very high. The number of people on government assistance is very high. That's not good for anyone. Having people who are unproductive and aimless and not working, that's not good for any of us. It's not good for them. And to have everyone else paying for it through inflation, it's just, that's not a positive. The rates of opioid abuse there are enormous. And we're saying, hey, listen, we need to bring jobs back. We need to be able to produce things. And in doing so, we're going to have to produce more than we consume for a while, which reverses things. And that does mean cutting back. I think that's why your calorie description is a really good one. If we've gone for 50 years using the credit card, we're going to have to shift from getting cheap and free stuff to producing more things for others. There are another group of people that have said, hey, listen, we're running businesses ourselves where to make our product at a reasonable price for our consumers, we need to access overseas goods. And if you put these tariffs in place, I'm going to be out of business. That to me is a really strong argument against what's happening. That to say, okay, wait, we want to save these people, but we're going to put these people out of business. Now, the other group of people who I don't have any patience for are, my peers who are talking their book, who need constantly higher asset prices to make money. That, if the S&P 500 is trading at, 25 times earnings, they're like, well, 30 times earnings. If we're at 30 times earnings, why not 35? Right? And they want constantly increasing asset prices. And my response to that is change your exposure. At Deep Knowledge Investing, I don't care if the market is up or down. We can change our exposures. I don't wake up saying I need the Federal Reserve to make me money, right? We can be long things. We can be short other things. We can change that exposure and make money in different environments. And, my Wall Street peers should be able to do the same. So what do we do here? Yeah, Matt, what would you do to address these competing concerns?
Yeah, I think one thing that you kind of touched on is I think it makes sense that now is kind of the time that Trump decides to do this. He does it when unemployment was pretty low, economy was moving along pretty well at the beginning of his term when his popularity was pretty high ahead of the midterms. I think it gives him a lot of runway to kind of eat some of this pain, which made me a little bit surprised that he kind of pulled back on it so quickly and that he kind of the way he kind of signaled it was that he did it because he was watching the markets. I would have thought he would have tried to kind of take a win and say, we got 70 countries to come and negotiate tariffs down. I was a little surprised by that, but I think this gives him a lot of runway, and they're not able to kind of wait him out until the end of the administration. So I think kind of thinking strategically, it makes a lot of sense that he did it now.
I think it's really interesting the way people are saying that he caved and, being very critical of the plan and saying, they should have taken that 90 days for negotiation from the beginning rather than threaten. And, maybe, if you can run alternate history, if we ran a different timeline, Alex probably can roll dice to figure out what happens in that timeline. But I'm not so sure that's the case. Imagine a scenario where a week ago, the president says, we're going to have these unspecified higher tariffs. We encourage people to get in touch with us over the next 90 days to discuss them. Well, what happens in that scenario? There's no question he shocked the market. We've seen carnage and massive record-setting volatility. But, I think the reason why in a week, 70, 75 countries, including the EU, including Japan, came and said, we want to talk, we want to talk. And I think we can assume that they don't want to talk about higher tariffs. They want to talk about lower rates. I think the reason for that is because he did shock the system, because he came out with these, wild, really high tariffs and said they're going into place. And people had a week of panic, but that brought 70, 75 countries to the negotiating table. And one of the things that I think the free trade crowd is missing on this is they're saying tariffs are bad, tariffs are a tax, high tariffs are a barrier, free trade is a benefit. All right, great. But why is nobody thinking about the possibility that these tariff threats could end up with lower tariffs as a potential outcome? Again, half the world just called the White House in the last week to negotiate. Does anyone want to argue they were calling to say, let's raise tariffs on our side, you raise tariffs on your side? No, they wanted de-escalation. So I think to a certain extent, the president's shock and awe campaign, this very aggressive, unpleasant, attack on the world trading system, it got a response. And that put him in a position where he could say, all right, well, now we need to have negotiations with 70 of our trading partners. If we do one of them in a day, you know what? Let's take the next quarter to have a conversation about it. That to me seems like maybe they're not as stupid as everybody's making them out to be. Alex, what do you think? Is it just all a bunch of idiots in the White House, or is there, potential method to this?
I don't think they're idiots. I mean, we've been hearing that Trump is an idiot for how long now, right? 8, 9 years. And I have the same reaction to that as I have a reaction when the right claims that the left is idiots. And I look around at the world being run by leftists and think, wow, maybe you haven't been paying attention to current events, but they've been kicking our asses, pal.
Yeah, at a minimum, Klaus Schwab was very effective.
Yeah. So I think it's really easy to cherry pick on short-term policy ups and downs and say, oh, this person is an idiot. But when you're dealing with very complex systems, you have to take a much longer view. To me, the jury is out on whether or not Trump is a madman or a man with a plan or a little bit of both, because there can be a certain beauty to madness at a strategic level. This has been studied by game theorists and generals and military experts for generations. And it's for exactly the reason you just said. There's an element of shock and awe. I think the open question to me is, did they intend to pull back on the tariffs this quickly, or was it because of the impact on the bond market and they decided to pull back more quickly than they expected? And I don't know the answer to that. And it's also entirely possible that in their playbook, they said, we're going to do this if the bond markets stay strong or we see improvement. Then we're going to keep hammering hard. If not, then we'll pull back, but start to negotiate, but stick hard on China. Like it could very well be an if-then plan. I certainly am not. I'm not privileged to know, and I don't think really anyone is. Everyone is kind of shooting from the hip and reacting with mass volatility in a way that's not. It's not very smart.
I think that's a good point. And it was actually something I was posting on X last night. Yesterday, I saw a lot of articles and a lot of concern that the reason for the 90-day delay was what you said, is the basis trade. So, for people who are coming in new on this, the basis trade is simply, hedge funds or large banks using massive amounts of leverage. And what they're doing is they're buying treasuries and shorting, futures against those treasuries at a slightly higher yield, and they're levering it up 40, 50, 60 times. And, they should have a supposedly guaranteed spread, levered up. And the fear yesterday was because concern about tariffs were causing US bond yields to rise. It was blowing up the basis trade. People were getting margin calls, and, hundreds of billions of dollars were pouring out of that. And the fear was, wait a minute, we have a financial plumbing problem. We have an issue where, this stress on the bond market combined with a hedge fund unwind of highly levered basis trade positions could actually cause settlement failures or banks to fail or something like that. And the thing that I'm going to read my post from last night was I'm seeing articles blaming fear of a market failure due to the basis trade for the tariff delay. Whether you agree with the tariff strategy or not, can we just agree that having too big to fail institutions that alter national policies is a bad idea? Let them fail or make them reduce systemic risk. And so, if what you're saying is true, then we basically have our foreign policy and economic policy being determined by ensuring that JP Morgan and hedge funds and other, money center banks don't have to deal with the levered risk that's on their balance sheet. Is there anyone who thinks this is a good idea? Is this the right way we should be approaching this?
I mean, I definitely don't think so, but the problem of these sort of highly leveraged financial derivatives being weapons of mass destruction has been known for a long time, and there seems to be little appetite to reform it. In a perfect world, we would have reformed that before we implemented tariffs, but I guess we don't live in a perfect world.
Yeah, a friend of mine, one of my friends on X responded, would have been nice to put this one away for good 15 years ago. I thought that was a great, like the time to nail this one home was 2008. And, to the extent that they felt like they needed to do a bailout then, fine, do the bailout, but reset the rules and tell them this is the last time. We're not doing this again. So, be prepared to either fail or, find a way to control your risk and be able to quantify it. And maybe 60x leverage is not a good idea, right? There's an old expression on, Matt, we'll go to you in 1 second. There's an old expression on Wall Street. It's called picking up nickels in front of a steamroller. It means, you can get very small amounts of money for free, and it's great until that steamroller just catches your pant leg and then you get flattened, right? Small amounts of free money, and then you just get wiped out. And I think that's what people were looking at with the basis trade, but we keep doing this every few years. Somebody needs to put a stop to it. Surprisingly, our banking, somebody on the banking committee, Senator Elizabeth Warren, seems to complain a lot about everybody else, but why she's done nothing in this area, I have no idea. Maybe it has to do with donations she's received. Matt, what were you about to say?
No, I just think that's I was kind of thinking a little bit adjacent, but something you keep hearing about is, like the bond markets aren't behaving the way you'd expect them to. Yields are rising, they're not falling. Is the dollar reserve currency, going by the wayside? And I think two interesting tidbits that we just saw yesterday and today, where we had a couple of treasury auctions that came in kind of oversubscribed. So, I think that's probably a little bit overblown. I thought an interesting thing, going back to one of our points earlier, was I think Elizabeth Warren was one of those people who was saying, this is the dumbest trade war in history. And that's just kind of that short-termism that you keep, hearing or seeing all the time. And I think that's one thing that you always hear, like, oh, US administrations, they're always like election to election, very short term. China gets to think in 100 years. I wonder if maybe and this is kind of the question that I think, Alex, you were alluding to, is Trump a genius or a madman? Like maybe this is one of the few times that the administration is really taking kind of a longer view, and they are willing to accept some short-term pain, at the expense of hopefully some long-term benefits.
That makes a lot of sense. Another place where I see arguments being made that I think are not great arguments. There are a lot of people, and in my opinion, I think there's been an unwillingness to understand that tariffs are a dynamic situation. So the free trade people talk about tariffs as a tax increase. Okay, fair enough. That is a legitimate point of view, but they don't talk about lower income taxes, right? And so the same people are saying, well, we can't have tariffs because that's a tax increase. But they're not pairing it with what the administration wants, which is lower income taxes. They're also saying, well, we can't have lower income taxes because we're running a big deficit, and they don't want to have inflation. Okay, fair enough, I got that. They want to take stimulus out, but if you really take this apart, it looks like what they're saying is we can't have tax increases, we can't have tax cuts. So apparently, again, we're stuck in this no change static situation. People are saying the status quo is bad and we want it to change in a way so that nothing changes, right? Our economic policy isn't working. Our trade policies aren't working. Our budget deficit isn't working, but we can't raise taxes. We can't lower taxes. We have to fix it without changing anything. I, I don't understand why aren't they making better arguments? And why aren't people noticing that they're saying we're against tax increases, we're against tax cuts? Everything has to stay the same and change. What do you do? Alex, what do you say to these people?
Well, if you take a long view of history, this is exactly why complex civilizations collapse, because you reach a point where the complexity of the situation is such that there's no reform you can make that will make the system better. The cost of the reform is such that it will temporarily get worse. And those who hold the power in the systems almost never are willing to make those reforms. And so they keep kicking the can down the road. And whether we're talking about, Rome or the United States, the human reaction to it is always the same. And it typically requires a person who has accumulated both power and wisdom, which is a rare combination, to be able to enforce a reform when the system reaches that point. Is Trump that person? I hope so, but it remains to be seen. But the arguments that we're seeing, you can completely imagine the exact same arguments happening just before any complex civilization went down the wayside. With Rome being like, well, how could we reform the system of latifundia farming that would jeopardize the senatorial class incomes? Totally not acceptable. You're like, okay, well, this is how you get a Dark Ages. Same thing is happening today. Same sort of people, same sort of mentality. I know that that's probably an overly long view and not particularly comforting, but my blog is called Tree of Woe.
Yeah, and is it true that Tree of Woe subscribers can get regular doses of micro despair, but if you want full on hysterical despair, that's an additional surcharge?
That's right. That's right. The free subscribers get weekly micro despair,
Yeah.
but the premium subscribers get paid mega despair once a month.
Yeah. I read those pieces. They are certainly upsetting. If any of you are having good weekends and you want to change that, I strongly recommend subscribing to Contemplations on the Tree of Woe.
Yeah, it's a really good antidote to like TikTok. You feel good. You saw some animal videos. You just come over to Tree of Woe. You'll feel bad again.
Yeah, it's an excellent plan. So another thing that I've seen people arguing, there are a lot of understandable arguments that are focusing on how badly the US is treating its friends and trading partners. And I saw these hysterical posts on X a week ago, people saying, well, that just blew 80 years of, trade relationships and allies. and friendships away in, one press conference. And I suspect they're picking 80 years sort of as, right around the start of the Bretton Woods system, which is where we were. And, my question for this is, okay, yeah, we should treat our friends well, but if they're friends, then why are the anti-tariff, pro-free trade people not similarly outraged by their high tariffs on us? Right? Again, there seems to be this unhealthy attachment to the status quo. It's fine if they have tariffs against us that are very high, or as you pointed out, Alex, other trade barriers, other non-tariff trade barriers. The important thing is that we don't upset them by raising ours. And to me, this seems really transparent, but I haven't seen any kind of uprising yet in the general commentary where people are saying, wait a minute, like it with friends like these, who needs enemies, that old expression, but why is it okay? Why are the people who advocate for free trade okay with having high tariffs on one side, but not reciprocal trade?
I think it's that classic case of the bully on the playground where they hit somebody and then you hit them back, and this guy throws the second punch is the one who gets in trouble. Like they've kind of had control of the narrative for the last however long you want to call it. And now we look like we're the ones who are suddenly antagonizing them. But yeah, when you peel back the onion, it is really just kind of more of something that's more reciprocal. So, I hear what you're saying. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. And I think it has to do with the fact that people are just reluctant to change. They see this really brash and intense shock and awe campaign. And I think the initial reaction is to kind of pull back and be like, why are we doing this? This doesn't make sense. I think if you look at I think if you were to say like, okay, what are the benefits that we get from with allies? And when we say allies, I think we typically mean Europe and maybe Japan and the like. If you were to weigh, kind of the pros and the cons, I don't know that it's totally unfair for us to want to try and, normalize these trade relations. It's not like we're getting some massive kind of dividends that, and in some other dimension, that's kind of equalizing the playing field or, the scales. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you, and I don't entirely understand, other than the fact that I think it's just a natural kind of human reaction to kind of, push back against any sort of change that people want to implement.
Can I jump in on this one, Gary?
Yeah, please.
So I read a really interesting tweet, X post, where the commentator said that the entirety of global institutions, the rules-based international order, was set up by the United States after World War II for the benefit of the United States. And that they thus perceived us as being both unfair and stupid. Unfair in that we were blaming Europe and Japan for the way they were behaving when they were behaving exactly the way they were told to behave when we set up the system. And stupid because we were dismantling the system that gave us power that we had built. And I thought about that for a long time because we did set up those institutions, and I think the people that set them up did set them up thinking they were going to be preserving American power and implementing a rules-based order that would keep America on top. The problem, as I feel, as I concluded after I thought about it, is that the people who set those systems up were wrong. They made key errors in their economic science. 80 years ago, they were just wrong on some things. And now we are paying the price for their mistakes. And so, yes, we do have to dismantle this system that we set up for our benefit because it turned out to not actually be for our benefit. And the people that were playing by its rules turned out to actually be able to exploit those rules against us. And so, yes, if we want to be selfish and smart, we should dismantle this system that we set up, thinking that we were being selfish and smart when we set it up, but we were wrong then, and we need to fix that. So that's my best understanding of why someone would criticize dismantling the system, and that's my answer to why we should anyway.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. You implement these policies, and how long do we have to be wedded to it? And were we at the center of it? Of course, yeah. Okay, guilty. But are we wedded to that for the next, for another 80 years or the next
Right.
800 years or,
Right.
however long this can go on? I think, one country that has a legitimate complaint on all of this is Vietnam. Um, and that's for two reasons. One is we went to the Vietnamese people, to the government, and said, hey, listen, we want to reduce our reliance on China. Can you handle more production? And Vietnam said, sure, yeah, we're happy to do it. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of their businesses are going to be put out of business. And their response, which I think is a reasonable one, is to say, wait a minute, you're accusing us of being unfair. We did what you asked us to do. We were a good trading partner according to the contract you sent over. The other thing that I don't know how you solve this is I don't know how, so Alex, you were talking before about these dynamic adjusting tariffs.
Yeah.
I don't know. How do we do that so that, that Vietnamese trade deficit gets resolved? Because they don't have enough people. The country, I was just there a couple of months ago. I spent a good chunk of January and February in Vietnam this year. And I was in the country 25 years ago and 20 years ago. And listen, things are so much better. They've gotten so much wealthier. Their quality of life has improved an enormous amount. But as of now, they don't have the GDP, the firepower, the need for the stuff that we produce to close that trade barrier. So what do we do with a country like Vietnam, which even with first of all, they did what we asked them to do, but even with a level trading the playing field, they're not going to close that barrier. Does that mean we should cut them off? I don't think we should, but I don't know the solution on that. What would you do?
Well, if we're taking the point of view of balanced trade theory, I think the argument would be, why is Vietnam able to sustain perpetual trade surplus to us? Because in classical free trade theory, you cannot, right? Ultimately, what happens is wage rates go up, or other balancing factors come into play, and trade has to neutralize. And yet we see instead, through mercantilist policies, you can have these unlimited. And the reason they can is that free trade theory is fundamentally wrong in that it assumes that you have mobility of product, but immobility of capital and labor. And when you have mobility of capital, then Ricardian free trade collapses. And so it's that mobility of capital into Vietnam. And so there is a capital and labor arbitrage happening. And the idea of balanced free trade is that balanced trade is that you want to prevent that. You want to prevent that constant arbitrage of labor and capital. So since Vietnam is benefiting from that, it's very hard to implement balanced trade without harming them, because you are in fact saying, hey, we're not going to let you benefit as much from arbitraging your lower cost of labor. And it double sucks for them if you've just gone and told them, hey, we want to benefit from your labor arbitrage, and we'd like to work with you on that, and then we change our mind. So I think it's probably implementing a balanced trade policy is fundamentally incompatible with the sort of deal we tried to put in place with Vietnam in the first place. And as I said, I just was reporting what I thought was going on. I previously have never endorsed balanced trade as a policy. I get where they're coming from. I'm agnostic on whether it's the right path to take. It may very well be that we should do much more targeted industrial policy, and one-on-one trade policy with nations would be a wiser course. So anyway, if we are doing balanced trade, I think it inevitably is going to hurt countries like Vietnam, because it actively strives to reduce their capital and labor arbitrage opportunities.
The thing I would add to it, and I think part of the issue is, if you're in an academic setting, the Porter's competitive advantage, the Ricardian trade model, these things make perfect sense, right? If you're sitting in a classroom and somebody explains it, it makes perfect sense. And you think, yeah, of course this is true. Why wouldn't it be true? And you pointed out an error in the way the model works, which is movement of capital. Great. I would maybe add one more, which is those models assume that things shift very quickly, which certainly if you're in a classroom, you say, okay, well, if you have a change in labor costs, then these things get moved around. And that's fine in businesses where you don't have an enormous amount of PP&E, right? Where you don't have a lot of capital expenditures, or where, it might take you half a decade to build an auto plant. It might take you, 6 or 7 years to build a leading edge fab plant for, for chips, for semiconductors. And so, there's this assumption that these things happen quickly, and, oh, well, your advantage just got reduced and our advantage in this area just got increased, so we'll shift it. But what do you do if it takes half a decade to build something enormous and people are saying, wait a minute, these things are constantly shifting. I don't know that I want to spend tens of billions of dollars building a new fab plant if I don't know where that advantage is going to be, right? In the academic models, you sort of assume that these things are like water in a bathtub, that they'll just flow very quickly and easily, and you'll have some waves in the bathtub, but 30 seconds later it'll all be flat and even again. That doesn't work in reality. So I think that's another flaw in the models they're using.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and also, when you take a long-term historical perspective, 5 years is a short period of time. When you're living through 5 years, it's a pretty agonizing, horrible period of time.
Well, that's true, but it's that half decade is also longer than our presidential administrations and our congressional administrations. And it's, if you're a senator, you can say, oh, well, I've got 6 years. No, you don't.
No, because you got to go back out and run for reelection in 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we're very much locked into short-term thinking on that. Matt, I thought you made a really strong point before regarding the way we're interacting with our trading partners. In the case of China, they have been expert at using our language against us, right? They're really good at publicly screaming that what we're doing is unfair, that we want to sabotage their development. And yet they maintain tariffs and non-tariff barriers that are far in excess of ours, despite being, the world's second largest economy. They've had all kinds of benefits from being designated, an emerging economic power at the WTO. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I don't know if you guys saw, I don't know if this is true or not, because I wasn't able to read the original Chinese, but did you guys see reports that China is threatening to withdraw IP protection for US companies operating in China? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, one, we didn't have that, right? Like, it has been their national policy to force companies that want to sell in China to establish production in China, hand over their IP. And then, you see a couple of years later, there's a state-owned enterprise with the exact same IP. And so, they're basically threatening to do what they're already doing. But beyond that, how in good conscience, unless you're assuming the people you're talking to are stupid and can't remember what happened yesterday, how do you claim, hey, listen, we're the good guys, you're the bad guys, but if you don't do what we want, if you don't let us have higher barriers against you than you have against us and our products, we're going to strip the intellectual property protection that we claim to give your people. Like, it was just brazen. It was blatant. And it's really interesting that somehow they're willing to claim to be a victim on both sides of this. And their response to that is to do nefarious things that they're already doing. And people are saying, oh no, China's mad. Well, all right. Okay, be mad.
Yeah, I think people have been willing to look past a lot of what China has said because the allure of being able to sell goods into that market has just been, tantalizing for companies. And if you go back to the WTO, that was one of the reasons the US was hoping that, if they let them into the WTO, that they'll kind of, move their market to be more in line with the US model. That US companies would be able to kind of sell their goods into the Chinese market. And you saw that forever. And you would have US companies who were kind of defending China in a lot of instances and lobbying Washington to go easy on them with certain tariffs. So I think that is one of the big reasons people are kind of willing to look past it for the, again, that short-term financial gain, even though in the long run, as you're seeing now, especially like the auto industry, they let you come in, they let you sell there for a little bit, and then all of a sudden you have an identical looking car that they can make for, 60% of cost. So I think that's the only thing that I can think of in terms of why people are so willing to look past them, because they do things all the time that are either, implicitly or downright explicitly kind of malevolent towards, the other trading partners that they have.
Yeah, by the way, I thought the funniest thing that happened yesterday was one of China's threats was to ban Hollywood films.
I saw that. Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, like, do you guys have no idea who's in the White House? Is there anybody in this administration who cares? Is there anyone in this administration who said, "Oh no, right? Hollywood might sell fewer tickets and may end up not producing their films to the taste of the CCP." Like,
As,
in what universe was that a threat?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. To build on what Matt said, the Chinese systematically do just what he said. And then often what happens is the US company that previously produced those products goes out of business because it can no longer do so. And then we find ourselves in a situation where the Chinese are the monopolists on the production of that product. They're the only ones that produce it. And an enormous number of people are criticizing the tariffs, and rightly so, suggesting that for many products, there is no alternative source. You simply have to buy from China. And so putting 100% tariff is just doubling the price of this essential good. And they're right. And it's a really bad situation for us to be in. And I don't have a great answer for what one does. But I will say, for exactly the reasons Matt just went into, if we don't change what we're doing, that will just keep happening, and more and more and more products will be exclusively delivered by people that at a minimum don't have our best interests at heart and may well be long-term, very profoundly enemies to our country.
Yeah, if we walk that road, best case scenario is that we lose our ability to produce anything, that we simply become a nation of consumers and we export dollars. And that's great until the rest of the world says, wait a minute, you don't produce anything. You don't actually have the economic power that enables you to just issue dollars. And then what? Then we have no production capacity. We have massive inflation. We have a failed world reserve currency. Like the people act like the status quo is stable. The status quo is tremendously unstable. If we don't change anything, that doesn't mean, okay, we can keep things as they are for the next 40 years.
Right.
It means an inevitable collapse. And that's like, if we were on a road and I said to you, there's a turn coming up. I'm letting you know, if we stay on this road, we're going to drive off a cliff. Do you take that turn? Yeah, of course you do. Does that mean that turn is going to take you somewhere good? No, it doesn't mean that. But the path that we're on 100% leads to disaster. And, Alex, one of the things that you said a couple minutes ago that I really agree with, and I've been putting in writing a lot, you said you don't know if the response from the White House is the right one. And I don't either. And it's something I've been putting in writing a lot. I don't know that this takes us to the right place. But I do know a couple of things. One is that the path that we're on definitely leads to disaster. We don't have another 40 years of issuing dollars and selling off and just going to the place where we have no production capacity. And yeah, great that we designed some consumer electronics and stuff like that, but that's not going to be enough to run a whole economy this size. The other thing is, I may not know the right answer on this, but I do know bad arguments when I see them. And one of the other bad arguments that's being made is there's a lot of focus on how badly the U.S. is treating its friends. But if there are friends, then why aren't the anti-tariff people similarly outraged by their high tariffs on us?
Right.
And to me, the proof that that's the right place to look was yesterday when the White House came out and they said, we've got 70 countries lined up to talk to us essentially about lower tariffs. So we're going to do a 90-day delay. The narrative immediately shifted to, oh, art of the deal. These guys are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. They screwed it all up. It was bad implementation. They're weak. They showed themselves to be weak. it was just criticism. And my thing on this is, if you are somebody who believes that tariffs are bad, that tariffs as taxation is bad, that this is a negative way to go, then why weren't they celebrating half the world's countries coming to us and saying, let's talk about lower rates? Right? Yesterday should have been a moment for celebration. And the fact that they weren't supporting their own arguments, right? That they're fine with high tariffs against us, or Alex, as you pointed out, high non-tariff barriers. And just they're going to, the White House goes forward with tariffs, that's bad. The White House backs off on tariffs, that's bad. And so to me, this looks more like badly designed political arguments rather than having, like, if these people really are academic Ricardians, if they really are, believers in Porter's, comparative advantage, then why aren't they saying yesterday was a huge win for our side?
Right. Well, it's almost as if maybe they're not actually believers in what they assert.
And that's why I come back to, I may not know the right answer, but I know a bad argument when I see it.
Yeah.
All right, Matt, going to you. Any final thoughts? What do you think happens next, or any key points you've got in your head that you want to make sure you get out? Alex, we'll go to you next.
I think it's just still trying to answer the question exactly what Trump was trying to get out of the tariffs. When you guys were just kind of talking about, I think what he did was show his cards a little bit, and not necessarily a bad thing, but I think what he's saying is he's willing to negotiate on tariffs, and he's not necessarily trying to keep these super high tariffs in place for a very long time. I think it's something that runs maybe a little bit counter to that is if he wants these in place for revenue purposes, then I don't know that you're going to see these tariffs come down necessarily. He has that 10% backstop. Maybe that's enough. Maybe he's content with the 10%, tariff revenue. But trying to understand exactly what it is that he wants, I think is helpful to try and understand how things are going to unfold. And that's a moving target because it seems like it changes quite often. But, if he does want those revenues, if he does want the tariff revenues, I think markets are probably not going to be thrilled with that because they're probably not going to be coming down. If he's willing to negotiate, maybe the tariffs do come down ultimately, and that would be, I guess, kind of the bullish scenario. But yeah, we'll have to see. It's just a pause for now. And I have to imagine that, maybe some negotiations go well. I'm sure some will not. If you're negotiating with 70 different partners, I don't even know if you can do that in 90 days. So maybe there's a follow-on delay. It's a lot of moving parts. I don't know that we're going to be able to kind of understand exactly where this is headed, until, well into the summer or beyond.
All right. Good points, Matt. And you're right. There is a lot of uncertainty. And Alex, final thoughts from you, but also I'd love to get your comment on something that Matt was just talking about. Do you think the Trump administration doesn't know what they want? They do know what they want, and this is the way they've decided to play it, or what they want is shifting as events transpire, and they're seeing the responses of our trading partners and, negotiating, the people on the other side of the table? What do you think's happening there?
I think the Trump administration knows what it wants. I think it doesn't necessarily know the best way to get what it wants. And I don't blame them for not knowing, because I don't think anyone knows. The system is extremely complex. I do think they have a clear vision for the outcome that they want. I think they've accurately come to understand that China is, at best, a mercantilist rival that needs to be dealt with as such, at worst as a severe strategic enemy. And they find themselves in many ways boxed in with very limited options, and they're trying to find the right path forward. It almost reminds me of the scene from Dune when Paul Atreides, with his blue eyes, stares off into the distance, and he says, there is a path. It's a narrow path, one path, and they're trying to far see and find that narrow path. So perhaps if Donald Trump shows up with blue within blue eyes and says the spice will flow, we can feel reassured that progress is happening. As for the rest, my final thought is that you are so right with the analogy of being on the road, heading towards a cliff, and you have to turn off the road. And I think you can use it as a heuristic when you're trying to understand someone who is criticizing Trump. Does that person Does that person acknowledge that the road we are on the status quo road, is a road that takes us off a cliff? And if he doesn't, I think you can pretty much disregard them as a serious critic because they're not acknowledging that, there is a need for change. On the other hand, if there are people who are saying, actually, there's another turn we could make, and this is the turn I suggest, then that's a person I find worth listening to.
All right. Sounds good. Matt, great having you on. Always great to get your opinion. So glad to have you as the newest part of Deep Knowledge Investing. Alex, so glad we were able to do this. Really appreciate the clear explanations and the ability to talk with your fantastic subscribers over at the Tree of Woe. How do people find you?
treeofwoe.substack.com.
All right. Sounds good. For everyone who's watched this, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. We're going to wrap up our live stream right now. And guys, give me 1 second just to shut everything down.